All right, thanking God once again for his compassion. Let's call Matthew chapter 15 compassion, part 2 or again or something like that, since we called Matthew chapter 14 compassion. But just as it literally came up in the 14th chapter, it's going to literally come up in the 15th chapter in roughly the same context as Jesus' compassion was noted in his feeding of the 5,000. Likewise, in chapter 15, it's going to be noted in his feeding of the 4,000, which comes up near the end of the chapter. But between that, we have two relatively famous stories that I'm just going to summarize generally because they're relatively well known and I'm kind of tired, even though it's just the start of a new week. Bottom line is I want to just put it in context and talk about it more from the perspective of the takeaways that it left me with in these three relatively famous stories. Understanding that our context in chapter 4 is the feeding of the 5,000, something that he was moved to do out of compassion, even though he took away from his own downtime after John's beheading to heal those who were still in need of healing, and understanding that he had withdrawn to a desolate place and they had followed him to that desolate place. He felt bad for them because they had nothing to eat. And so that was the context of the feeding of the 5,000 on whom he had compassion. However, he is going to continue traveling in chapter 14 until he reaches a place called Gennesaret, where he does more healings. And even though it doesn't sound like, or it doesn't literally say he's moved by compassion, it seems like he is, because another low-key application of another famous healing, the touching of the fringe of his garment, as we mentioned in the last chapter, marks the way in which many are healed in Gennesaret, him being compassionate enough to allow them to be healed by merely touching the hem of his garment. And so Matthew chapter 15 is going to mark a departure from that compassion, understanding that it is kicked off by the famous story of the Pharisees who travel all the way from Jerusalem, I think still to Gennesaret, to ask him what seems to be a super petty question. Why is it that your disciples don't wash their hands before they eat? Essentially violating the tradition of their, the Pharisees, tradition of the elders, it's going to say. So understanding that, Jesus is going to turn the tables on them to say, why do you use your traditions to violate the commandments of God? Understanding that God has told them to honor father and mother. It typically means financially or by taking care of them financially. They will invalidate that requirement by saying they essentially get a 2-for-1 because any money they give to God is actually going to double as what they should have given to mother and father. And he's going to literally tell them that you don't get a 2-for-1. What you've done is use your tradition to invalidate the law. So what's more important, your traditions or the things you're neglecting that God has told you to do? Once again, the things that relate to having compassion on your own mother and father. And so understanding the Pharisees' motives in traveling that far. When I looked it up, if it is Gennesaret that they travel to, it's roughly a 2-hour drive, a 33 plus hour walk. Understanding that then they might not have been fully walking, but they sure weren't driving. Bottom line is they traveled a long way just for petty purposes, only to be confronted by a glaring hypocrisy, going back to what Jesus said about trying to correct someone who has a splinter in their eyes, trying to see past the log in your own eye. This seems to be an illustration of that principle from the Sermon on the Mount. However, moving forward, he is going to return to that whole concept of compassion as he is going to withdraw from there and presumably the drama that comes along with them following him with such a petty question, to the region of Tyre and Sidon, where he is going to be met by a woman whose daughter is oppressed by a demon. And it's not going to seem super compassionate the way he addresses her, because he's going to say it's not proper to give the children's food, meaning the children of Israel's food too. He's going to say the little dogs, understanding that she is a Canaanite woman, and the Canaanites were historically a huge problem for the people of Israel. Every time God tried to get them set up in a healthy direction for the nation, the Canaanites were there to draw them back into toxic habits. And so it is not clear whether or not he is addressing her as coming from the people, or the people he would describe as the little dogs, because of their history of being a thorn in the side of Israel and the good things that God had planned for them, or whether or not by the time you get to the end of it, it seems like he does have a lot of genuine compassion for her. And in spite of his outwardly short answers, he might have been actually restraining a desire to help. However, it seems that his ministry was first to Israel as a starting point for God's mission to reconcile all of humanity to himself. But in his focus, in his very curt answers to her, even in the midst of that one very rude answer, or I'm going to say it seems rude, I'm not going to call God rude, but in the midst of that very direct answer, he seems like he is really trying to keep it brief. And by the time he finally opens up, it seems like his opening up to the woman comes with a lot of compassion for her and her situation. Again, admiring her faith in much the same way he seemed to admire the faith of the Roman centurion that he healed, or who he did a healing on behalf of earlier. Understanding all that, though, the apparent compassion he had, even in the midst of some tough words that he had for the lady, seems to set the stage for the final story, where he is then going to walk near the region or around the region of Galilee, doing more healings, specifically called out for his compassion, seeing that in the midst of those healings, once again, the people do not have enough to eat. That being the context of the feeding of the 4,000, specifically called out for or motivated by the compassion he had for the crowd, in much the same way it was motivated, or the feeding of the 5,000 was motivated by the compassion he had for the crowd. One of the distinctions between the two feedings probably being important to note going forward into chapter 16, as he is going to have more conflict with the Pharisees, this time the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He did more with less. That's pretty traditional in the way of teaching points between these two feedings, understanding that with the feeding of the 5,000, he started out with less to work with than he did in the feeding of the 4,000. And with the less to work with, he had more left over, helping to emphasize that it's not the physical supply that we have as much as our, once again, our attitude or our perspective toward what God is capable of doing. A point that the disciples are going to miss, as he is going to caution them in the next chapter to be careful of the leaven of the Pharisees. Understanding he's not talking about bread. It's what he's going to challenge them with. Did you not learn the lesson from the two previous feedings? The amount of food we have with us ain't as much the issue as our attitude toward what God can do. And that's exactly what he's going to warn them about, is keeping the Pharisees and the Sadducees from reaching their potential in life and in their relationship with him in chapter 16.